White Castle is often overlooked. They have around 400 restaurants, which is relatively small in the fast food world, considering most of the major chains have grown into the thousands. McDonald's, for example, has almost 40,000 locations worldwide, which literally means White Castle is 1% of their size. They are mostly found in the Midwestern states and around the New York area, with a few exceptions in Florida and Arizona, so depending on where you're from, you may not be too familiar with White Castle. In fact, I would bet that for many of the people watching this, your biggest exposure to the restaurant has been through Harold and Kumar, which I would say does give a pretty accurate depiction of them, but it's still the reason that I wanted to make this video. There is so much more interesting and I would say important stuff to talk about when it comes to this restaurant. So for today, I want to talk about what's been happening with White Castle while highlighting what I perceive to be some of the biggest reasons behind their success. First off, I need to start by saying that White Castle is generally considered to be the first ever fast food restaurant. 2021 actually marks their 100th year of operation, and I think that's amazing. Think about that. They predate every fast food restaurant that you have ever been to or has ever existed. Today, they are significantly smaller than McDonald's, but there was a time when McDonald's was trailing them. They were operating decades before McDonald's even started, and even sold their 1 billionth burger in 1961, a full 2 years before McDonald's did it. They originated a lot of the concepts that we see in fast food today, so we can technically say that pretty much every one of them is imitating White Castle in some way, but early on, there was a pretty direct imitator that I want to mention. They were called White Tower, and I mean, this was undeniably a ripoff. White Castle was only 5 years old in 1926, but so successful that White Tower started their own strikingly similar chain in Wisconsin. They copied the name, the building, and even the slogan. White Castle would encourage people to buy them by the sack, whereas White Tower would ask you to take home a bag full. Early in the 1930s, White Castle sued them and forced them to alter their building design a little bit, and there was a royalty payment involved, but White Tower still got pretty big, eventually growing to over 200 locations, which was about the same size as White Castle. I just think that's a great example of how they established something so different and so desirable that many others wanted to imitate it. Another reason behind their success is another thing that makes them significant. White Castle helped popularize the hamburger. I mean it when I say that without the work of Walter Anderson, I'm not so sure that they would be nearly as popular as they are today. See, in 1916, he started this very small business where he renovated this old streetcar and turned it into a hamburger stand. It was at a busy intersection with low overhead, so it did pretty well. He continued opening an additional one every year, but when he was looking to open his 5th one, he instead teamed up with a real estate agent named Billy Ingram to start a new concept called White Castle. It was amazingly very much like the one that we know today, with the castle shape and their signature slider hamburgers. They were made in a unique way for the time, so much so that many people credit this as the first modern-day hamburger. He would squash down this ball of meat with a spatula, cook it with onions all over the place, even place a bun on top of the meat to get all the flavors going. He was doing some revolutionary stuff on that grill, but the issue was that people didn't like hamburgers. They were unpopular and generally frowned upon. I know, that sounds weird, but about 15 years earlier, Upton Sinclair released his famous book called The Jungle. Parts of it exposed the conditions at meat processing plants, how they were unsanitary, and there was a lot of bad stuff happening there, so it made the public very apprehensive about eating ground beef or hamburgers in general. And by the way, it's not like they were that popular before anyway. A hamburger wasn't a typical meal. It was seen as more of a novelty food, I guess maybe in the same way that we would look at cotton candy. So you can see the issue here. White Castle started as a business centered around a food that was unpopular and even somewhat feared. So unlike any restaurant today, they had the difficult task of getting people to trust and try hamburgers. So early on, that's how they spent most of their efforts. There is so much I can mention here. It was pretty much everything they did. The name White was included in their name as a way to convey cleanliness. They had these bright white buildings complemented by white bags and white uniforms. When everything is white, you can see that it's clean, and that was a huge emphasis. In addition to that, they would grind up the beef and grill it in front of the customers so they can see exactly what was in their burgers. They even did this thing where they invited housewives from the area to take a tour of their local White Castle. They were all guided by actresses playing this character named Julia Joyce. There would be a huge emphasis on how clean everything was, how transparent they were about what's in their beef, and at the end of the tour, they were given coupons to motivate them to give White Castle hamburgers to their family for dinner. In 1930, they went so far as to commission a study at the University of Minnesota where a medical student volunteered to consume nothing but White Castle hamburgers and water for 3 months. He was eating something like 20 hamburgers a day, and according to his daughter, he never ate another hamburger after this. But when the 3 months were over, he was evaluated to be perfectly healthy, and it kind of gave White Castle the green light to advertise their health content. Again, there's so much more that I can mention, but I just want to convey that White Castle spent years trying to change people's perception about hamburgers, and obviously were successful with it. Today, they are selling these sliders in large quantities. In the early 1990s, they started their cool new slogan, "What You Crave," and in 2001, that inspired the name of their Crave case. I don't know who else is selling 30 hamburgers at a time, and today you could buy 20 at a time in the Crave Clutch, or 100 at a time in the Crave Crate. If you have ever bought the Crave Crate, please tell me about it, because there must be a story there. My next reason behind their success is innovation, and my first two reasons are obviously already displaying some big time innovations, but there's still more to it. Consider that they were so early with most of this that there wasn't much of an example to follow, so they had to kind of innovate their way forward just to make it all work. I'm just gonna go fast here. The paper hats that they wore as part of their uniform, they made this machine that was so efficient in producing them that they eventually started a subsidiary around it that would supply the hats to the rest of their industry. Another one is, remember how they would smush down that ball of meat into a flat hamburger? Well, the process motivated co-founder Billy Ingram to develop this heavy-duty stainless steel spatula that they quickly sold hundreds of thousands of. In the 1940s, someone from the company had this idea of putting 5 holes in the patty. It made it so you didn't have to flip them over, they cooked faster, so it saved some labor and cut down on the customer wait times. Another big innovation is related to my next reason, smaller locations. Especially early on, these buildings were small, generally less than 200 square feet, where seating was limited to only a few stools at a counter. That's actually why they introduced their whole buy 'em by the sack slogan. It was a way to get people to buy a sack of hamburgers to go so they can make a sale and not take up valuable space in the restaurant. And it's worth mentioning that in the early 1930s, before others were doing it, they advertised it with a coupon in the newspaper. Since those buildings also had that signature design, they had the idea of pre-making them and then dropping them off at the location. It allowed them to easily move locations if one wasn't performing well, and it allowed them favorable lease terms for small portions of land. Much like the paper company, they created a whole subsidiary out of it called the Porcelain Steel Building Company that would produce stuff made from those materials and sell it to other businesses. Plus, having small locations that were pre-made internally made it easy enough for them to expand and open new locations, reaching well over 100 of them within their first decade. My next reason behind their success is the fact that they've remained independent and operated their business with very little outside help, and I'm talking about to an extreme degree. For one, they've always maintained very little debt, meaning they haven't been reliant on banks or bondholders or anyone else willing to lend them money. In 1921, they borrowed $700 to get things started, paid it back within their first 3 months of operation, and have kept their debt pretty minimal ever since. Secondly, they've remained a private company that's been owned and operated by a member of the Ingram family since the very beginning. In 1933, Billy Ingram bought out his partner's interest in the business, and today their CEO is Lisa Ingram, the 4th generation of the family to lead the company. Finally, White Castle has also avoided franchising, and this one is big. They have made a few attempts as a way to expand into foreign markets, starting in Japan in the 1980s and then Mexico and some others, but as far as I can tell, none of them have been too successful. The main point is that for the last 100 years, every US White Castle has been owned and operated by the company itself, which is rare. In fact, this is all uncommon in the fast food industry. Here, I'll challenge you to name any other large fast food chain that fits all of those same criteria. Honestly, this reason is debatable because many people will argue that it's actually held back their success. It has definitely kept them smaller, but on the positive end, it has given them more stability over the years and tighter control. So at this point, it comes down to how we define success, and I'm choosing to look at the brighter side of this one because their more conservative approach has helped lead to my next reason on the list, a cult following. A fun example of this would be the Beastie Boys, who are from New York. They mentioned mentioned White Castle in 5 different songs on their album Licensed to Ill. But again, the biggest, most perfect example of this would have to be Harold and Kumar. White Castle was the restaurant chosen as their destination because it fits so perfectly with the story that they were trying to tell. Sure, there's a lot of craziness, but at its core, it's 2 people with such a craving for White Castle that they're willing to go through quite a bit to get there.
There's a White Castle that's open 24 hours up in Cherry Hill. It's about 45 minutes from here.
I can make the trip if you're willing to.
It really is like a perfect representation of them. Their following is small, in part because they just don't have the same reach as many others, but it's also very dedicated, possibly proven by the success of their frozen sliders, the ones that you could buy at the grocery store. See, in the 1980s, much like today, there was a big demand for White Castle in all of these areas of the country that didn't have the restaurants. And even with that demand there, their current system makes expanding into new areas somewhat impractical. It separates them from their suppliers, and since they're funded by their own profits, it could be hard to get the money together. Plus, they seem very risk adverse, and I don't know, it may impact their cult status, so instead, they set up this program called Burgers to Fly, where they would deliver frozen sliders to anywhere in the US within 24 hours. That program did very well, and by 1987, they ended it and instead chose to take it a step further by having their frozen burgers sold in supermarkets across the country. And alright, of course, they're not quite as good, but it has been a profitable way for them to attract some customers that aren't within their limited range of the restaurants. So there you have it, my biggest reasons behind the success of America's oldest and maybe most beloved fast food restaurant. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of White Castle? Do you respect the way that they've chosen to operate, or would you consider it more of a missed opportunity? Should they be taking out debt and franchising and everything else that the others are doing, or are they smart in following their current path? Because really, in a strange turn of events, White Castle helped create an industry that has since, I guess, evolved past them, and today they sort of operate beside it. Also, have you ever even been to White Castle? And if you have, what do you think of those little hamburgers? Were Harold and Kumar overselling it, or were they right on the money? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.